The grain barn had been in the Calloway family for 4 generations, and nobody had ever thought it was worth much of anything. That was the opinion of everyone who had ever stood in front of it, turned their mouths down, and said what a shame, what a pity, what a waste, and then walked away to leave someone else to deal with it. The barn squatted at the far end of a long slope of weed-choked grass on 12 acres of worked-out farmland in Pickard County, Ohio. The wood had gone gray. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The tin roof had rusted in long, brown-orange streaks that bled down the siding like something quietly bleeding for years. 3 of the 6 high windows along the east wall were gone entirely, replaced with whatever weather had done to them, and one corner of the foundation had settled at an angle that made the whole structure appear to be slowly, patiently leaning toward the earth it stood on, waiting for permission to lie down. Her name was Nora Calloway. She was 62 years old, and she had just been handed the barn in a will reading that her cousins treated like an insult. She had driven 4 hours from Columbus to attend the reading of her Uncle Gerald's estate on a gray Tuesday in early October. The attorney's office was in a building on the town square that still had the original tin ceiling from 1931, and Nora had sat in one of 4 chairs arranged in front of a wide oak desk, while Gerald Calloway's 3 stepchildren arranged themselves with the particular studied casualness of people who already knew what was coming and had already decided what they thought of it. Her uncle had never married. He had come close once, a woman named Patrice who left after 2 years to go back to her family in Michigan, and after that Gerald had seemed to make a quiet peace with his own company and the particular rhythms of a man who lives alone on inherited land. He had worked the fields until his knees gave out at 59, then rented to a neighboring operation for 15 years, then stopped working entirely and lived simply on what he had saved, which was not much. His stepchildren were the result of a brief, late-life marriage to a widow named Connie Marsh in his early 70s, a marriage that lasted until Connie died and left behind 3 adult children from her first husband who had, over the following years, spent enough time around Gerald to ensure they were present for the reading. The oldest stepchild, a man named Brent Marsh who drove a Lexus SUV and wore a fleece vest with a real estate company's logo embroidered on the chest, sat with his arms crossed and said almost nothing. His sister Diane sat beside him with a notepad and a pen. Their younger brother Kevin scrolled his phone until the attorney asked him to put it away. The attorney's name was Harlan Royce, and he read the will with the flat, unhurried efficiency of a man who has read thousands of them and learned to treat each one as a document rather than a drama. The property at 4401, County Road 18, the main farmhouse, the 2 adjacent hay fields, the tractor, the contents of the house, all of it went to Connie Marsh's 3 children in equal thirds. Gerald had apparently made this arrangement 3 years prior in a codicil that he had signed and witnessed without telling anyone about it. The 3 of them absorbed this without visible reaction. They had known. The 12 acres at the south end of the property, including the grain barn and the access road, those went to Nora. Brent looked at her when Harlan read it. Not with cruelty, exactly. With a kind of indifferent amusement that was, in its own way, worse. "Well," he said when Harlan finished, "that's the old ruin at the back of the property. Gerald used it for storage. Honestly, I'm not sure the structure's safe to enter." He said it as though he were doing her a favor, giving her information she needed. The county assessed the land alone at about $18,000. The barn itself, they'd probably pay you to knock it down. Diane nodded. Gerald always said it was a money pit. He kept meaning to tear it out, but never did. She clicked her pen. "You might be able to sell the acreage to Dave Holler. He farms adjacent. He's been after that parcel for years." Nora looked at the paperwork in Harlan Royce's hands. Her name was typed cleanly on the deed transfer. The grain barn at the end of the slope. 4 generations of Calloway land. Her grandfather's grandfather had built it. "I'll take it," she said. Brent smiled. It was a polite smile, the kind that contains a private judgment. "Of course," he said. "Well, safe travels." She drove back through town afterward and stopped at the diner on Main Street where she had come with her parents every summer as a child. The counter still had the same green vinyl stools. She ordered coffee and a piece of apple pie, and she sat there for a long time looking at the menu board, which hadn't changed much, and thinking about what she was going to do. The practical answer was that she had no good options. She was 62. She had worked for 31 years as a records administrator at a hospital in Columbus and had taken an early retirement buyout 18 months ago when the hospital merged with a larger system and offered employees over 50 a package to leave. The package was not generous. It had covered her car and 6 months of bills, and she had been careful with the rest. She was not broke, but she was not far from it either, and she had reached the age when the distance between comfortable and desperate felt shorter than it used to. She had a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus with 8 years left on a mortgage she was beginning to find uncomfortable. She had no children. She had 2 close friends, a brother in Denver she spoke to twice a year, and a history with a man named Paul who had moved to Savannah 3 years ago and occasionally sent photographs of the river on her birthday. What she did not have was a plan for the next 30 years. She finished the coffee and left a cash tip larger than the bill and drove out County Road 18 to look at what her uncle had left her. The barn was worse than she remembered it. She had not been to this property since she was in her late 30s, a visit for a holiday that she recalled as brief and vaguely uncomfortable, the kind of visit adult family makes when they feel they ought to rather than when they want to. The main farmhouse was a white 2-story with black shutters and a front porch that Gerald had added himself, and Brent Marsh was already walking its rooms with a clipboard, measuring tape hanging from his belt, doing whatever it is people do with clipboards and measuring tapes when they have already decided what a place is worth and are only there to confirm it. She drove past the house on the access road and continued down the long slope to where the grain barn sat at the property's south edge. The access road was 2 tire ruts through the grass, barely visible. She parked at the bottom and got out and stood in the October wind and looked at it. The barn was roughly 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, timber-framed, with a gambrel roof that had held better than the rest of the structure. The double doors at the front were secured with a rusted padlock that had been locked for long enough that the chain beneath it had stiffened and darkened with oxidation. A hand-lettered sign above the doors read Calloway Grain Established 1908 in paint so faded it was nearly invisible unless the light hit it at a low angle, which it was doing now in the thin October afternoon. Nora walked the perimeter. The foundation was poured concrete, old-style, cracked in 3 places along the south wall where frost heave had pushed up through the decades. The east wall windows were as bad as they looked from a distance. The wood siding on the north face had softened in places where water had been getting behind it, and when she pressed her palm flat against one such section, the board gave slightly under the pressure, spongy, compromised. Not every section was like that. Most of the structure was merely neglected, not ruined. She found the barn key on the ring Harlan Royce had handed her with the deed. It was a large, flat-headed skeleton-type key, newer than it looked, and it turned in the padlock after some coaxing and a spray of WD-40 from the kind she kept in her car. The smell that came out of the barn when the door swung open was the smell of old grain dust and dry wood, and something faintly sweet and heavy, the smell of a building that has been sealed against air and weather for a long time and has developed its own private atmosphere. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of something very old that had not yet decided to give up. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The interior was a single large threshing floor with a high central space under the gambrel roof, and what she could see of it, in the thin light coming through the open doors and the 3 remaining east windows, was that Gerald had used it as general storage for the last 30 years of his life. Rusted farm equipment stood in rows like sleeping animals. 2 grain augers, an ancient corn sheller, 3 sets of wooden pallet shelving along the north wall piled with plastic tote boxes and cardboard cartons and canvas bags, and the various accumulation of a man who kept things rather than discarded them, because that was how his generation dealt with objects that had once been useful and might be again. The threshing floor itself was wide plank oak, dark with age and decades of grain dust worked into the grain of the wood. Solid. She walked the center of it, feeling the floor under her boots, and it held without complaint. In the center of the barn, suspended from the ridgepole by iron chains, was the remains of what had been the grain cleaning mechanism, a hand-operated fanning mill. The arms were seized with rust, and the wooden housing around the fan had split along one seam, but the iron framework was complete, and whoever had made it to last. She walked the barn for 40 minutes. By the end, she had a rough picture of what she had. An 80 by 40 timber frame structure in neglected but not terminal condition. A threshing floor that appeared sound. A collection of Gerald's stored objects that would need to be sorted and cleared. And something else she noticed only on the second pass through the space, something that nagged at her without fully declaring itself. The north wall was not right. She stood in front of it for a while, looking at the shelving units Gerald had built against it, floor to ceiling, practical open shelving made from 2x4s and particle board, the kind of shelving a person builds when they need storage and have the lumber. The shelving itself was nothing unusual, but behind it, in the gap visible where the end unit stood 6 inches from the wall's corner, the wall was different from the rest. The east and west and south walls were original timber frame with vertical board siding applied to the interior surface. Old wood, gray-brown, uneven, the kind of surface that comes from 100 years of temperature change and settling. The north wall, behind the shelving, was something else. Stone, not poured concrete like the foundation. Cut stone, limestone blocks laid in courses, the kind of stonework you don't do casually. The kind you do when you are building something meant to endure. She could only see a strip of it, perhaps 8 inches wide, between the shelving unit and the corner. But it ran from the floor to as far up as she could see in the dimness above. She stood there in the late afternoon light coming through the open doors, looking at that strip of cut limestone, and the nagging feeling she'd had on the second pass became something more specific. She had looked at a lot of documents in 31 years as a records administrator. She knew what an anomaly looked like. She knew what it felt like when one thing in a file did not match the others. This did not match. She drove back to the diner in town and had dinner, and she asked the owner, an older woman named Ruth who had clearly been at the diner for at least 40 years, about the Calloway grain barn. Ruth set her coffee down. Old Franklin Calloway's barn, she said. Your people. Your Gerald's niece? His brother's daughter, Nora confirmed. Ruth refilled her cup without being asked. That barn's been there since before I was born. Franklin Calloway built it. His father before him had a different building, but Franklin tore that out and built the one that's there now. He was the one who had money in this family, back in the 20s and 30s. Grain business. He had a deal with the county cooperative for 20 years. Stored grain for other farms, processed it, ran a brokerage operation out of that building. She paused. When the cooperative folded in the 50s, the business went with it. Gerald's father kept farming, but the grain brokerage was done. The barn just became a barn. Do you know anything about the construction? Nora said. The north wall is stone. Cut limestone. Different from the rest. Ruth looked at her with an expression Nora couldn't quite read. Then she picked up a rag and wiped the counter slowly. My father used to say, Ruth said, not quite looking at her, that Franklin Calloway didn't trust banks after 1929. He said Franklin built something in that barn for himself. A room, or a vault, or something. But my father was a storyteller and half of what he said about people in this town was invented. She put the rag down. Nobody ever found anything, far as I know. Gerald certainly never mentioned it. Nora drove back to Columbus that night with the key in her jacket pocket and 4 hours of highway to think. She was back the following Saturday with her car loaded with what she needed for a long day of work. Work gloves, a pry bar, a flashlight and a headlamp, a tape measure, a notepad, a thermos of coffee, and a clarity of purpose she had not felt in 18 months. She parked at the barn, unlocked the doors, propped them wide to let in the light, and spent the first 2 hours moving the storage shelving away from the north wall. The shelving units were Gerald's construction, screwed together with coarse drywall screws, and they came apart without much ceremony. She stacked the contents in the center of the threshing floor, plastic totes of old seed packets, cartons of mason jars, canvas bags of who knew what, a coffee can collection of bolts and hardware organized with the systematic habit of a man who grew up in the Depression and never entirely left it. By mid-morning, she had the north wall clear. It was entirely limestone. The entire north interior wall of the grain barn, floor to the roof plate, was cut stone, laid in courses, pointed with old lime mortar that had darkened with age to near black between the blocks. The stone itself was pale gray gold, the limestone that came from the local quarry that had operated in Pickard County from 1892 until the mid-1970s. Good stone, carefully cut, precisely laid. This was not a wall built by a farmer doing a rough job. This was a wall built by someone who had paid for a mason. She spent 20 minutes running her hands over the surface, letting her palms read the texture and the temperature. The stone was cold and dry. The mortar was hard and sound. There was no obvious seam, no hinged section, no visible door. Just wall. Then she took out her tape measure. She measured the barn's exterior north wall, which she had paced and measured the previous week. She measured the interior distance from the threshing floor to the south wall. The difference between the two was approximately 6 feet. 6 feet unaccounted for on the exterior versus the interior. She checked her measurements. Did them again. Stood in the center of the threshing floor and did the arithmetic on her notepad 3 times. 6 feet. On the other side of the limestone wall, there was a space 6 feet deep that did not appear on the inside of the barn. She picked up her pry bar. She was not going to knock through a limestone wall with a pry bar. That was not the tool for limestone. But she was going to find the door, because there was a door, because you do not build a 6-foot chamber behind a cut stone wall without a way in. She started at the east end of the wall and worked west, running her fingertips along the mortar joints, feeling for changes in depth or temperature, looking for shadow lines in the joins that might indicate a frame rather than a solid course. She had gone about 15 feet when she found it. A vertical join in the stone, running floor to ceiling, was slightly wider than the others. Not much. Half an inch, maybe, but consistent, the same width from the stone floor to the roof plate above. A seam. On the other side of the seam, the stones were set at a fractionally different angle in their mortar, a change so subtle it would be invisible unless you were looking for exactly this. She followed the seam up with her flashlight. At the top, where the wall met the roof plate, there was a stone that sat slightly proud of its neighbors, just enough to cast a hairline shadow in the raking flashlight beam. She reached up and pressed it. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. The stone moved. Not far, not dramatically a quarter inch inward, with the faint, dry click of a mechanism that has not been operated in a very long time, but was built well enough that time has not entirely defeated it. From somewhere inside the wall, she heard the sound of iron moving against iron. The seam she had found, the vertical line running floor to ceiling, opened. Not swinging outward like a door opens in a house. Pivoting, at the center, the way a revolving panel works, so that one side came toward her and the other receded into the wall. It moved slowly, stiffly, the stone scraping against the floor with a grinding resistance, but it moved. 3 inches. 4. 6. A smell came out of the gap that she had no prior reference for and would spend weeks trying to describe afterward. Dry, cold, mineral, like the inside of a stone church in winter. And under that, something else. Old paper, old metal, old wood that had been sealed away from air and moisture for long enough to develop its own particular stillness. She pushed the panel wider, leaning her weight against it, and it ground open another foot and then stopped, seized, unwilling to move further. 1 foot was enough. She turned sideways and stepped through. The headlamp picked up the space in a sweep that her brain took several seconds to process. The chamber was roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, the full width of the north wall section. The ceiling was low, just over 6 feet, with timber joists above and the underside of what appeared to be a second timber floor above that. The walls were the same cut limestone as the interior face, but these courses were plastered over with a thick white lime plaster that had stayed bone dry for however long this room had been sealed. On the plaster, in faded pencil, someone had written columns of numbers, dates, figures, the careful notation of a man who kept records by hand. Along the west wall, a wooden shelf ran the length of the room at waist height. It was built from the same timber as the joists above, heavy and deliberate. On the shelf, placed with the particular care of someone arranging things they expect to stay arranged for a long time, were objects covered in canvas tarpaulins, small ones, pressed flat over shapes that held their form beneath the cloth after all this time. On the east wall, at eye level, there was a framed photograph. Nora stood in the center of the chamber with her headlamp throwing flat white light across the plaster and the penciled columns and the canvas-covered shelf, and she breathed the cold mineral air of a room that had been shut away from the world for decades, and she understood without yet knowing a single specific fact that she was standing in something her great-grandfather had built deliberately, with intention, and had sealed and left behind for a reason. She reached out and lifted the edge of the nearest canvas. Beneath it were ledger books. 6 of them, bound in dark cloth covers, the kind that had been manufactured in the 1920s and 1930s for commercial record-keeping. They were stacked in 2 neat columns of 3, as precisely as library volumes. She picked up the first one and opened it. The handwriting was clear, practiced copperplate, the hand of a man who had been educated at a time when penmanship was taught as a matter of character. At the top of the first page, in ink that had gone brown but remained sharp and legible, Calloway Grain Brokerage Private Accounts 1924. Below that, columns, dates, names, figures, transaction records. But also, further in, something else, correspondence. Letters folded and tucked between the pages, some still in their envelopes, some loose. Bank statements from institutions she didn't recognize. Documents in a hand different from the ledger entries, typed on letterhead she couldn't immediately identify. She lifted the second canvas. A metal strongbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, the kind with a lock. The lock had a keyhole she recognized, flat-headed skeleton type. She reached into her jacket pocket. The key Harlan Royce had given her with the deed. The key that she had assumed opened the barn's padlock, and which had but the padlock on the barn doors was modern, a replacement. This key was older than that padlock. The key had been made for something else. She crouched in front of the strongbox and fit the key to the lock. It turned on the first try. The lid opened on hinges that had been oiled at some point with a care that time had dried out, but not entirely destroyed. They moved with a faint resistance, a soft resistance, like turning a page in a very old book. Inside the box, the contents had been packed with deliberate thought, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and brown at the edges but had held its purpose. Nora peeled the oilcloth back with both hands. There were certificates, a stack of them, perhaps 40 sheets, each one roughly the size of a piece of letter paper, printed on heavy bond stock in the formal style of the early 20th century. Engraved borders, official seals, the kind of printing that announced value by its own physical weight. She lifted the top certificate into the beam of her headlamp and read. It was a stock certificate, issued by the Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company of Cleveland, Ohio, dated September 14, 1929. In the name of Franklin Calloway. 100 shares of common stock. She lifted the next. The same company, a different date, a different number of shares. March 3, 1927. 250 shares. The next, July 1928. 500 shares. She went through all of them. The stack represented, by her rough count in the dimness of the chamber, somewhere between 4 and 5,000 shares of common stock in the Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company of Cleveland, Ohio, accumulated by her great-grandfather Franklin Calloway between 1922 and 1929. Each certificate was signed in his hand at the bottom. Each had its transfer stamps intact. None had ever been redeemed or sold. Beneath the certificates, wrapped separately in a second layer of oilcloth, were 2 documents. The first was a handwritten letter on Calloway Grain Brokerage letterhead, dated October 24, 1929, in Franklin's copperplate. She read it standing in the cold of the chamber with her headlamp tilted and her breath making small clouds in the still air. Franklin had written it to himself, or to whoever found this, which amounted to the same thing, a man riding into the future because he did not know what the future held, recording what he knew while he still knew it. He wrote that the markets had collapsed that week, that he did not know the full extent of what had happened or what would follow, but that he was sealing the stock certificates in this box because he believed the exchange would eventually reconstitute itself and the shares would have value again. And he did not trust banks any longer, and he did not trust the general estate process to protect what he had built, and he wanted these to pass to his own blood without being absorbed by creditors or circumstance. He wrote, "I am not certain of anything right now except that I built this business with honest work and I will not let it disappear into someone else's hands without a fight. If you are reading this and you carry my name, the shares belong to you. They were earned clean. Take them to the right people and find out what they are worth." The second document was an original, stamped certificate of business registration for the Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company, issued by the state of Ohio in 1903. It was a founding document. Nora sat down on the stone floor of the chamber with the papers in her lap. She sat there for a long time. Outside the barn, the October wind moved through the grass on the slope, and the afternoon light had gone from thin gold to gray in the time she had spent inside. And when she finally walked out of the chamber, through the panel, and back into the main threshing floor, the barn around her felt different from how it had felt when she entered it. Not because anything about it had changed. Because she had. She drove back through Pickard County with the Strongbox on the passenger seat and the first ledger on top of it, and she stopped at Ruth's diner and sat at the counter and ordered soup because it was getting cold and because she needed to sit somewhere ordinary while she thought about what was not ordinary at all. Ruth brought her soup and bread and refilled her coffee and looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who has been reading faces across a diner counter for 40 years. "You went out to the barn," Ruth said. It was not a question. "I did," Nora said. "Find anything interesting?" Nora looked at her soup. "My great-grandfather built a chamber behind the north wall. Inside it there are 6 ledger books from the grain brokerage business, a strongbox with stock certificates, and a letter he wrote in October of 1929. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, my father wasn't entirely a storyteller." Nora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I need to find out if the Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company still exists in any form. Whether a company founded in 1903 and still operating in 1929 had any successor entity. Whether these certificates represent anything." She paused. "I'm a records administrator. Or I was. I know how to trace a document chain. But I need a starting point." "My nephew," Ruth said immediately. "Aaron Beal. He's a corporate attorney in Columbus. Does a lot of historical property work. Old title chains, dormant asset recovery, that kind of thing. He's 40. He's good. And he doesn't charge people he likes more than he should." She looked at Nora steadily. "I'll call him tonight. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." Aaron Beal called her the following morning at 8:15. He had a clear, quick voice, the voice of someone who thinks faster than he talks and has learned to pace himself for other people's benefit. Ruth had told him the basics. He asked 3 questions: the company name, the state of registration, and the date on the oldest certificate. He went quiet for a moment after she answered the third one. "Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company," he said. "Ohio registration, 1903. You're sure about that name?" "I have the founding document in front of me," Nora said. Another brief silence. "I need to look at the certificates in person," he said. "Can you come to Columbus?" She was already in Columbus. She had driven back the previous evening with the strongbox and the ledgers in the back seat under a blanket and had not slept well and had been awake since 5, going through the ledger books at her kitchen table, reading Franklin's columns of numbers and the letters tucked between the pages, and assembling a picture of a man she had known only as a name on a family tree. She was at Aaron Beal's office by 9:30. He was a compact, focused man with reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose in a desk that was covered in organized stacks of paper in a way that would look like chaos to a stranger, but which she recognized immediately as the organized chaos of someone who processes documents for a living and knows exactly where everything is. He looked like Ruth around the eyes. He shook her hand, sat her down, and opened the strongbox himself, unhurrying, with the same deliberate care she had used the day before. He went through the certificates one by one. He made no sound for the first several minutes. When he reached the bottom of the stack, he put them down, took off his glasses, and looked at her. "Do you know anything about the history of grain trading in Ohio?" he said. "Not much," she said. "The Midland Grain Exchange and Trust Company was incorporated in 1903 as a regional cooperative exchange for central Ohio grain producers. It operated independently until 1938, when it merged with 2 other regional exchanges to form what became the Ohio Agricultural Exchange Corporation." He put his glasses back on. That entity operated until 1967, when it was itself acquired by a company called Central Plains Agribusiness, which in turn merged with a larger regional firm in 1979. He paused. Central Plains was absorbed into what is now the Hartwell Agricultural Holdings Group, which has been publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange since 1984 under the ticker HH. Nora was quiet. "Hartwell is one of the 20 largest agricultural commodity businesses in the country," Aaron said. "They handle storage, processing, futures brokerage, and transport for grain across 12 states. Their market capitalization as of last Friday's close was approximately $4.7 billion. He set a certificate flat on the desk between them and looked at it for a moment. Each merger in that chain involved a share conversion. The Midland shares converted to Ohio Agricultural Exchange shares in 1938 at a ratio of 1:3. The Ohio agricultural shares converted to Central Plains shares in 1967. Central Plains converted to Hartwell in 1984 when it went public. At each conversion, unredeemed shares remained valid and were carried forward in the successor company's capitalization records. Meaning these certificates are still active, Nora said. Meaning these certificates are still active, he confirmed. In their original denomination, they represent 4,800 shares of Midland Grain Exchange stock. After the 1938 conversion, that becomes 14,400 shares of Ohio Agricultural Exchange. After 1967, the Central Plains conversion ratio was 1:2, so 28,800 shares. After the 1984 public offering and Hartwell conversion, there were 2 additional stock splits, one in 1991 and one in 2007, each at 2-for-1. He looked at his notepad. The current equivalent holding, before any verification of the specific conversion documentation, would be in the range of 115,000 shares of Hartwell Agricultural Holdings common stock. The room was quiet. Outside Aaron's window, Columbus was going about its Tuesday morning. Traffic on the street below. A construction crew doing something to the sidewalk. The ordinary sounds of a city that didn't know anything had changed. At Friday's closing price, Aaron said carefully, 115,000 shares of Hartwell Agricultural Holdings would be valued at approximately $7.4 million. Nora looked at the certificates on the desk. Then she looked at the Strongbox. Then she looked at the framed photo on Aaron's wall, which was of a fishing trip with a man she assumed was his father, 2 figures in a boat on a flat lake with the sun going down behind them, and she looked at it for a moment because she needed to look at something ordinary. That's before dividends, Aaron said. Hartwell has paid a quarterly dividend without interruption since 1986. The accumulated dividends on a holding of this size, going back to the date the shares should have been converted but weren't, may represent a separate recoverable amount. I'd need a forensic accountant to run that calculation. It won't be a small number. Nora took a breath. Let it out slowly. What do I need to do? Several things, in order, he said. First, I need to verify the certificates against Hartwell's historical shareholder records. They maintain conversion documentation going back to the original constituent companies. Second, we need to establish clear chain of title from Franklin Calloway to you. The deed transfer your uncle left you covers the property, but we need to trace the ownership of the certificates specifically. Third, Hartwell has a process for dormant shareholder claims. It takes time, but it's a defined process and the law is clear on valid successor claims. He looked at her over his glasses. This is recoverable, Nora. All of it. The certificates are genuine, the chain is documentable, and you are Franklin Calloway's direct descendant. There is nothing complicated about this claim except the paperwork, and paperwork is what I do. She called her brother in Denver that evening. His name was Stuart, and he had left Ohio at 24 and never particularly looked back. And they had the particular relationship of adult siblings who love each other from a distance and do not often require proof of it. He answered on the third ring in the surprised way of a person who wasn't expecting to hear from her on a Tuesday evening. She told him everything. The barn, the wall, the chamber, the strongbox, the certificates, Aaron Beale, the number. Stuart was quiet for longer than she expected. Uncle Gerald knew about this, he said. I don't think he did, she said. The shelving was built against the wall in a way that blocked it. The mechanism in the stone was hidden well enough that you wouldn't find it without looking for it specifically. I think Gerald used the barn for storage and never knew what was behind the wall. And Brent Marsh, Stuart said. His voice had changed slightly. Gave me the property without a second thought, Nora said. Said it was a money pit. Said Gerald would probably have paid to knock it down. Another silence. How did you find the chamber? Stuart said. The wall measurements didn't add up, she said. The exterior was longer than the interior. 6 feet unaccounted for. I was a records administrator for 31 years. When something doesn't account for itself in a document, you look for what's missing. Stuart made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. Franklin left it for family, he said. He left it for whoever carried his name and needed it, Nora said. That's what the letter says. He couldn't know which generation or which person. He just sealed it and trusted that eventually the right person would find it. She heard him exhale. Are you all right? I think so, she said. I'm still processing it. You should call me more than twice a year, he said. I know, she said. I will. The verification process took 6 weeks. Aaron Beale was systematic and thorough, and his assistant, a young woman named Cassidy who had the organizational instincts of someone 40 years older, produced the chain of title documentation with a speed that impressed even Aaron. The Hartwell corporate archives were cooperative. They had, in fact, a dedicated department for historical shareholder services, because dormant and successor shares were not as uncommon in a company assembled from a century of mergers as people might expect, and the department's coordinator, a retired accountant named Walter Greer, had been doing this specific work for 22 years and took visible professional pleasure in a case with complete original documentation. Walter called Aaron directly during the 4th week. Nora was in the room when Aaron took the call, sitting across the desk with her coffee, and she watched Aaron's face as he listened, which told her what the news was before he said anything. He put down the phone and looked at her. Walter found the conversion records, he said. The Midland shares are confirmed in Hartwell's predecessor documentation. The transfer to Ohio Agricultural Exchange in 1938 is recorded. Every subsequent conversion is tracked. The shares were carried forward as a dormant holding under the original certificate numbers at each step. He paused. He also found something else. In 1947, the Ohio Agricultural Exchange Board approved a discretionary stock dividend for all shareholders of record, paid in additional shares rather than cash. The Calloway holding, because it was dormant, accumulated those shares without being redeemed. They compounded forward through every subsequent conversion. Nora set down her coffee. The actual current equivalent holding, Aaron said, is not 115,000 shares. It's closer to 162,000. She did the arithmetic in her head with Friday's closing price and stopped before she reached the end of it. Walter's formal letter will have the exact figure, Aaron said, but you should prepare yourself for a number north of $10 million. The town of Pickard knew what it knew before Nora had decided how she felt about any of it. That was the nature of small places. Information traveled through them the way water travels through old plumbing, fast, certain, and by routes you wouldn't necessarily predict. Ruth had told her nephew. Her nephew had a secretary. The county deed transfer was public record, and Aaron had filed the initial claim documentation in Pickard County as well as Franklin County. Someone at the county recorder's office had a cousin who worked at the grain elevator where Brent Marsh did some of his real estate business. By the time Nora drove back out to the barn on the second Saturday in November to meet with the structural engineer Aaron had recommended, she had already received a text message from Brent Marsh. It read, "Nora, I heard there may be some historical items in the barn that have value. I think we should talk. Some of those items may have been part of Gerald's general estate holdings and not specifically covered by the deed transfer. Give me a call when you get a chance. Brent." She read it sitting in the car at the end of the access road with the barn in front of her. The gray November morning light lay flat over the grass on the slope. A crow was working through the field along the east fence line, unhurried, purposeful. She forwarded the text to Aaron Beale with a one-line note. He started. Aaron's reply came in under 4 minutes. Expected. Don't respond. I'll handle it. The structural engineer, a woman named Pam Osterhaus who had been assessing agricultural buildings in central Ohio for 18 years, walked every inch of the barn with Nora for 3 hours. She probed the sill plates. She read the timber joints. She took photographs of the foundation cracks and measured the lean at the northeast corner and spent 20 minutes in the chamber behind the limestone wall, running her hands over the stone courses and the plaster and tapping the floor with the heel of her boot. When they were finished, they stood outside in the November cold and Pam Osterhaus gave her opinion the same way Aaron Beale gave his, directly, without cushioning. "The bones are good," she said. "Better than good for something this age." Franklin Calloway's carpenter knew what he was doing. The timber frame is white oak, old growth, the stuff they don't make anymore, and it's dry. The gambrel roof structure is sound. The northeast corner needs a foundation repair, which is a known, defined job. The east wall windows need to be replaced or rebuilt. Same with the sill plates on the east face where water's been getting in. None of it is beyond repair. She looked at the barn with the appraising squint of someone calculating what she would need. This building can stand another 100 years with the right work. What would the right work cost? Nora said. Pam gave her a range. It was not a small range, but it was a range, and it had a lower end and an upper end, and both of them were, relative to what Aaron Beale was telling her about the Hartwell shares, a number she could work with. She told Pam she'd be in touch. She stood at the barn doors after Pam left and looked at the threshing floor, at the fanning mill suspended from the ridgepole, at the pale October light coming through the east wall openings, and she let herself think, for the first time since the chamber, about what came next. Not what to do with the money. That was Aaron's territory, and she trusted him with it. What to do with the barn. What her great-grandfather had built, and what it could still be. A man who had worked honest for 20 years, and then sealed the evidence of it behind a stone wall and left it for family, for whoever came after him who needed it. Who had written, "I built this business with honest work," and who had trusted, without any guarantee, that the thing he built would eventually find its way to someone who understood what it was. She thought about the ledger books. The correspondence tucked between the pages, 40 years of business letters from Ohio grain farmers. Dozens of names she didn't recognize, the record of transactions between people who grew food and a man who helped them sell it. A whole world of ordinary commerce, sealed in a dry room for 90 years, waiting. She thought about the framed photograph on the chamber wall, the one she had not yet examined properly because she had been too consumed by the documents. She went back inside and stood before it with her headlamp. It was a photograph of the barn, taken from the slope above, looking down, on a summer day sometime in the 1920s, to judge by the cars visible in the background. The barn was in its prime in the photograph, the wood fresh and pale, the windows intact, the doors standing open. And in front of the doors, a man in shirt sleeves and suspenders, squinting into the sun with his hand raised to shade his eyes, looking at whoever was taking the picture. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that was neither handsome nor plain, simply the face of a man who spent his days outdoors doing physical work and had the weather of it. Franklin Calloway, her great-grandfather, the man who had built this. She had never seen a photograph of him before. Her family did not have one. He had died in 1952, before she was born, and whatever photographs had existed had apparently not survived the decades. She had known his name and approximately when he had lived, and that he had built the barn, and that was all. Standing here in the barn he had built, with the photograph in her headlamp beam, she saw something in his posture that she recognized, the posture of a man who is standing in front of something he made with his own hands and knows it is good. Brent Marsh's attorney filed a claim the following Monday asserting that the Strongbox and its contents constituted personal property of Gerald Calloway's estate, separate from the real property transferred by deed, and therefore subject to distribution under the will's residuary clause. The filing was, Aaron told her, about what he expected, thin on law and heavy on hope, but filed because the alternative was to do nothing and watch. Aaron's response took 2 days to prepare and 14 pages to deliver. It documented, with attached exhibits, the following: that the Strongbox and certificates had been sealed inside a concealed chamber constructed by Franklin Calloway no later than October 1929, which predated Gerald Calloway's ownership of the property by nearly 40 years. That the chamber and its contents had been physically incorporated into the barn structure and were therefore appurtenant to the real property, transferred with the land and building. That Franklin Calloway's letter constituted a testamentary direction for the disposition of the certificates to his blood descendants. That the deed transfer to Nora was complete and recorded, and that Gerald Calloway had no documented knowledge of the chamber's existence and therefore no basis for a claim of personal property ownership over its contents. The filing also included a letter from Walter Greer at Hartwell's Shareholder Services Department confirming that the certificates were valid and that a claim verification process was underway. Brent Marsh's attorney withdrew the filing within a week. There was no communication from Brent directly. Diane sent a short text to Nora that read only, "I'm sorry about how we acted at the reading." Nora read it twice and did not respond immediately, because she was not yet certain how she felt about it, and she had learned, at 62, that certainty was worth waiting for. She drove out to the barn that weekend with a thermos and her notepad and the 6th ledger book, the one she had not yet finished reading, and she sat on the threshing floor with her back against the limestone wall and read for 2 hours in the pale November light. The last entries in the 6th ledger were from 1938, the year of the first merger. Franklin had written a final entry on the last page, a single paragraph rather than columns of numbers. He wrote, The exchange will be absorbed next month. I am told my shares convert and the business continues under a different name. I have decided I do not need to watch this. I built what I built, and it is done. I am 62 years old and my knees are not what they were, and I believe the best work of my life is already finished. Whatever comes from these shares, I am leaving in the chamber for whoever finds them. If the barn stands long enough, they will. The barn will stand. Nora sat with the ledger in her lap and looked at the threshing floor, at the fanning mill, at the pale winter light coming through the east wall openings where the glass had long since gone, at the stone chamber behind its panel, door open now, airing out after 90 years of darkness. 62 years old. His knees not what they were. Believing the best work of his life was already finished. She thought about the hospital in Columbus and the buyout package and the apartment with 8 years left on the mortgage and the 18 months she had spent not quite knowing what to do next. She thought about what Ruth had said about her father's stories and whether they were true. About what Brent Marsh had said at the will reading. She is welcome to it. We consider it a gift. She closed the ledger. The barn will stand. Franklin had written it in 1938, and he had been right. And 86 years later here she was, 62 years old with her back against his limestone wall, and the barn was standing, and so was she. Walter Greer's formal letter arrived on a Thursday in late November, delivered to Aaron Beale's office by courier. Aaron called her at 8 in the morning, before she had finished her first cup of coffee, and read her the relevant paragraph over the phone in the same measured voice he used for everything. The voice of a man who had decided early in his professional life that calmness was a service he provided to people who had reason to be uncalm. The confirmed equivalent holding in Hartwell Agricultural Holdings common stock, adjusted for all conversion ratios and stock splits from 1938 forward, was 161,420 shares. At the prior day's closing price of $68.14, the total current market value was $10,997,348.60. Nora set her coffee down on the kitchen table. That's before accumulated dividends, Aaron said. Walter's team has run the preliminary dividend calculation. Hartwell has paid quarterly since 1986. The dormant holding accrued dividends at each payment date without distribution. Those dividends compounded in the record system. His preliminary figure for recoverable accumulated dividends is approximately $840,000, subject to final audit. She looked out her kitchen window at the Columbus morning. A neighbor was scraping frost off a windshield. A dog was being walked in a coat. Everything was exactly as it had been at 8 o'clock on every Thursday morning for the past 18 months, and also entirely different. What do I need to do? She said. Come in this afternoon and sign the claim documents, Aaron said. Hartwell's shareholder services will process the transfer over the next 4 to 6 weeks. The shares will move into your name. The dividends will be calculated and dispersed separately. I'd recommend we set a meeting with a financial advisor before that happens, someone who can structure this appropriately. I have 2 people I trust. He paused. Also, Nora, congratulations. Franklin would be pleased. She signed the documents that afternoon. Aaron had printed them in a neat stack and walked her through each one with the patient efficiency of someone who knows that the volume of paperwork is not the point, but that the paperwork still matters. She initialed and signed for 40 minutes, and then it was done, in the way that large legal facts are done, not with noise or ceremony, but with ink on paper and a date stamp and an envelope going into a courier bag. On the drive home, she stopped at a hardware store and bought 2 things, a can of weatherproofing sealant and a new padlock for the barn doors. She drove out to Pickard County without planning to. The highway was gray and flat, and the November fields on either side were the stripped pale color of harvested ground. Everything taken, everything waiting for spring. She drove down the access road to the barn and parked and got out and stood in the cold for a moment looking at it. The late afternoon light came at a low angle off the west field and hit the siding of the barn at a slant that made the old wood glow faintly, the way old things sometimes do when the light is right. Not beautiful exactly, but present, substantial, the color of something that has lasted because it was built to. She walked to the barn doors and applied the padlock. Then she walked the perimeter one more time, not looking for anomalies this time, not measuring, just walking. The foundation crack on the south wall. The soft siding on the north face. The east windows with their open sockets where the glass had gone. The gambrel roof solid against the gray sky, the white oak timbers underneath it doing what they had been doing for 116 years. She stood at the east wall for a while with her hand flat against the siding. The wood was cold under her palm. Dry? The barn's warmth was its own, generated by the mass of stone and timber, and it bled through the wall slowly, even in November. Pam Osterhaus had said this building could stand another 100 years with the right work. Nora believed her. She drove home in the dark and called her brother. Stuart had been waiting for news in the way he did things, quietly, without pressure, giving her the space to come to him. When she told him the number, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fix the barn," she said. A pause. And then, "I'm working on that part," she said. She was working on it. The shape of what came next was assembling itself in her mind the way a document organizes itself when all the pieces arrive and the structure clarifies. She had spent 31 years making records make sense. She knew that feeling. She was waiting for it here. The Hartwell shares transferred to her name on a Wednesday in mid-December. She did not look at the brokerage account for 2 full days after Aaron confirmed the transfer. On the third day, she opened it at the kitchen table and looked at the number for a long time without moving. She had grown up in a family that did not have money, not poor, but careful. Her father a machinist, her mother at the school cafeteria, money talked about in lowered voices when children were nearby. She had spent her adult life the same way. What was on the screen did not fit inside any framework she had built for thinking about money. It required a different framework entirely. She closed the laptop. She made toast. She ate it at the kitchen window and thought about Franklin at 62 writing in his ledger that the best work of his life was probably finished, and about what he had actually put in that chamber. Not certificates. Those were the instrument, but a decision. A decision to build something that would outlast him and trust that whoever needed it would come. She opened the laptop and called Aaron Beale. "I want to do 2 things, she said when he answered. "One is the barn restoration. Pam Osterhaus gave me a scope and a cost range. I want to start in the spring. The second thing is more complicated, and I want your help thinking through it." "Tell me," he said. The ledger books in the chamber document 40 years of grain brokerage transactions between Franklin Calloway and farmers across Pickard County and the surrounding area. Hundreds of names, correspondence, records, the business history of this part of Ohio from 1922 to 1938. She looked at the ledger stacked on the corner of her table. That's a historical archive. It should be somewhere that preserves it and makes it accessible, not in a strongbox behind a wall. A university, Aaron said, or a historical society. Ohio State has an agricultural history collection. Ohio Historical Society has rural records going back to the 1800s. "I want to donate the ledgers," she said. "The letters, the correspondence, all of it. Keep the certificates and the founding document and Franklin's letter, those belong with the family. But the business records belong to the community they came from." Aaron was quiet for a moment. "That's a meaningful gift," he said. "A collection of that age and specificity, intact and in good condition, is genuinely unusual. They'll want to document the provenance." "Good," she said. "Then the story of how they were found is part of the record." She met with the curator of agricultural collections at Ohio State in January, a careful, enthusiastic man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who wore the same expression throughout their meeting that Nora imagined she had worn in the chamber. The expression of someone encountering something they had reason to hope existed but had no assurance of finding. He turned the pages of the first ledger with cotton gloves and did not speak for several minutes. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "do you understand what this is?" "A record of my great-grandfather's grain brokerage," she said. "A primary source for Central Ohio agricultural commerce in the 1920s and 1930s, he said. "We have almost nothing from this period in this region at this level of specificity. The correspondence alone, letters from farm operators during the Depression years, is extraordinary." He set the ledger down with the same care she had used. "Where has this been?" "Behind a limestone wall in a barn in Pickard County," she said. "For 90 years. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "Thank you." The donation was formalized in February. Dr. Webb's team drove to Columbus with archival boxes and acid-free folders and spent a full day in her apartment carefully packaging each ledger, each letter, each document, cataloging as they went. The collection was assigned a formal accession number, Ohio State University Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, Calloway Grain Brokerage Records, 1922 to 1938. It would be processed, digitized, and made available to researchers within the year. On the afternoon, the archivists finished and carried the boxes out to their van. Nora stood in the corner of her living room where the ledgers had been stacked for 4 months and looked at the empty space they had left and felt something she didn't try to name precisely, only recognized as a kind of rightness, the feeling of a thing finding the place it was meant to be. Spring came to Pickard County the way it always does in Ohio, reluctantly, and then all at once. The first warm week of March brought Pam Osterhaus back to the barn with her contractor, a methodical man named Carl Haas, who had been restoring agricultural buildings in the county for 28 years and who walked the barn with the same slow, proprietary attention Nora had used on her first visit. He agreed with Pam's assessment, and he agreed with her scope, and he gave Nora a start date of April 1st. He was there on April 1st. Nora drove out every weekend for the next 3 months. Sometimes she worked alongside the crew. She had no useful construction skills, but she could clear and carry and sort and haul, and she did. The foundation crack on the south wall was cut out and repoured. The soft siding on the north face was stripped back and replaced with matching timbers sourced from a salvage yard in Morrow County that dealt in reclaimed barn wood of the right period and species. The east windows were rebuilt with new sash and old-style wavy glass that Carl sourced from a supplier in Pennsylvania who made it specifically for historic restorations. The sill plates on the east face were sistered where they had softened and replaced where they were gone entirely. The gambrel roof got new flashing at the ridgeline and the valleys, and one section of the decking near the northwest corner was replaced where water had worked through for long enough to compromise it. The rest held. Pam had been right that the bones were good. The fanning mill came down from the ridgepole in May. Carl's crew lowered it carefully and set it on sawhorses in the center of the threshing floor while the roof work was underway. Nora spent 2 evenings in the barn that week cleaning the iron with a wire brush and linseed oil while the light lasted, and when the crew put it back on its chains in June, the iron was clean and the wooden housing had been consolidated and stabilized by a conservator Carl knew who worked on historic farm machinery for several county museums. The fanning mill would not work again, but it would stand. The chamber behind the limestone wall was cleaned and documented. A local photographer named Sarah Kim, who did architectural work for historic preservation projects, came out in May and spent a full day photographing the chamber, the panel mechanism, the limestone courses, the plaster with Franklin's penciled columns, every detail. Those photographs went to Aaron Beal's files, to the Ohio State Archive as supplementary documentation to the Calloway collection, and to Nora's own records, which she was beginning to keep in a way that would hold up over time. The work was finished in late June. Nora drove out on the last day Carl Haas was on site and walked through the barn while his crew loaded their tools. The threshing floor gleamed in the afternoon light, swept clean, the old oak boards dark and sound under her boots. The east windows threw 4 squares of early summer light across the floor. The fanning mill hung on its chains. The limestone wall stood smooth and solid along the north face, the panel closed, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Carl shook her hand at the doors. "Good building," he said. "Worth saving." "I know," she said. Ruth from the diner drove out with her nephew Aaron 2 days later. Nora met them at the barn doors and gave them what she had come to think of as the proper tour, starting with the exterior, working through the threshing floor, and ending at the north wall, where she showed them the panel mechanism, the keystone in the upper course that triggered it, the way the section pivoted on its iron hardware. She opened the panel and took them into the chamber. Ruth stood in the center of it for a long time with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the plaster and the penciled columns and the shelf where the ledgers had sat for 90 years, and she did not say anything for a while. "My father used to say Franklin Calloway was the most careful man in Pickard County," she said finally. "Said he never did anything without thinking it through 3 times. Said he was a man who believed in making things that lasted." She looked at the stone courses around her. "I think about him driving out here in 1929 with his certificates and his Strongbox, in October, with everything collapsing around him, and deciding that the right move was to seal it up and trust the future. That takes something." "It takes more than I had at 62, Nora said. "You found it," Ruth said simply. "That takes something too." They sat on the threshing floor afterward with the barn doors open to the June afternoon and ate the sandwiches Ruth had brought. A red-tailed hawk worked the field along the east fence line. The creek that ran along the south boundary of the 12 acres was audible as a faint sound of moving water. The summer afternoon had the particular quality of an afternoon that knows it is being observed and holds itself still for it. Aaron told her that the final dividend disbursement from Hartwell had cleared the previous week. The total, after his fees and the restoration costs and the taxes on the dividend income, was a number she was still adjusting to, the same way you adjust to a change in light when you move from a dark room into afternoon sun. It took time. The eyes had to recalibrate. "What are you going to do with the barn now?" Aaron asked. She had been thinking about this for 6 months. The answer was clear enough that she had stopped thinking of it as a decision and started thinking of it as a plan. "Franklin built this as a grain brokerage," she said. "A place where farmers brought what they had and someone helped them understand its value and get it to the right buyer. That was the business." She looked at the threshing floor. "I don't know anything about grain, but I know something about records. About what gets lost when people don't keep them. About what survives when someone does." She had already been in conversation with Dr. Marcus Webb at Ohio State and with the director of the Pickard County Historical Society, a woman named Louise Hargrove, who had spent 20 years trying to build the county's archival capacity with volunteer labor and a budget that never quite covered what was needed. She had been in conversation with the small library in the county seat that had a local history room in its basement, staffed one afternoon a week by a retired schoolteacher named Harold, who did it because nobody else would. What she had in mind was not complicated, but it was specific. The barn would become a research and archive center for Pickard County agricultural history, affiliated with Ohio State's Rural Collections Program and the Historical Society, with a small permanent staff, a proper archive room built into the chamber in the North Bay, and a program for collecting, digitizing, and preserving the records of farms and rural businesses across the region before those records disappeared into landfills and estate sales the way most of them eventually did. She would call it the Calloway Grain Archive. Franklin's name on the building, his ledgers at Ohio State as the founding collection, is building the place where the work continued. Louise Hargrove had cried when Nora described it to her over the phone. Harold from the library had driven out to the barn the following weekend without being invited, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looked at the threshing floor, and said he would volunteer every day he had available if Nora would have him. She told him she would. Stewart came from Denver in July. He had not been back to Ohio in 11 years, and he came with the slightly uncomfortable air of a man returning to a place he had put distance between himself, and not sure if the distance still made sense. He drove out to the barn with Nora on his second day and stood in the threshing floor and looked around for a long time. "Gerald never knew," he said. "Gerald never knew," she confirmed. "And Brent Marsh gave it to me to get rid of it," she said. Stewart walked to the north wall and put his hand flat against the limestone. He stood that way for a moment, not saying anything. "I should have stayed in touch more," he said. "We both should have," she said. He turned around. "I'm thinking about coming back. Denver is expensive, and I'm 67 and my knees aren't what they were." He said the last part with a slight smile, because she had told him about Franklin's ledger entry and he had not forgotten it. "I don't need much. I just want to be somewhere that makes sense." "Pickard County makes sense to me now," she said. "I didn't expect it to." "You fixed the barn," he said. "Of course it makes sense." She thought about Brent Marsh occasionally, not with anger that had burned off over the winter, leaving nothing. He had made a calculation at the will reading based on what was visible, a derelict structure on worked-out land, worth less than the trouble of dealing with it. He had been correct by every measure available to him. He could not have known about the limestone wall or Franklin's October afternoon in 1929. He had also called it a money pit and handed it over with a smile that contained a private judgment, and she was not required to be entirely neutral about that. She replied to Diane's text 2 months after receiving it. "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you're well." She meant both sentences. That was enough. On a Saturday in August, Nora drove out to the barn alone. The early morning was still cool, the dew heavy in the grass on the slope, and she unlocked the doors and propped them wide, and went inside and stood in the long light coming through the east windows. She had brought Franklin's photograph, not the original that she had left in the chamber where he had put it, where it would stay. She had had it professionally copied the previous spring, and she had framed the copy, and she had brought it today to hang it in the main threshing floor, on the east wall where the morning light came through, where anyone who worked in this building going forward would see it. She stood on a stepladder and drove the hanger into the wall between two of the repaired window frames, and she hung the photograph, and she stepped down and looked at it from the center of the threshing floor. Franklin Calloway in shirt sleeves and suspenders on a summer day in the 1920s, squinting into the sun with his hand raised, standing in front of his barn. The barn in its prime behind him. The doors open. The wood pale and new. She had thought, when she first found the photograph in the chamber, that what she recognized in his posture was the posture of a man who knows the thing he is standing in front of is good. She still thought that. But standing back from it now, in the restored threshing floor of the barn he had built, she saw something else too, something she had not had the distance to see before. He was not looking at the barn. He was looking at whoever was taking the picture. He was looking at the future. He was looking at the person who would eventually stand where she was standing, the person he was building for, the person he trusted to come. He did not know her name or her age or the specific shape of her trouble. He just trusted the barn to find her. The morning light moved across the threshing floor. The hawk was back in the east field, working the fence line. The creek ran along the south boundary of the 12 acres, as it had always run, as it would run long after she was gone. She pulled the door of the chamber open, the limestone panel pivoting on its iron hardware as smoothly now as it had in October when she had first heard it move, and she stepped inside. The plaster walls. Franklin's penciled columns. The shelf where the ledgers had sat. The photograph was on the wall, where it had always been. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it, and at him, and at the barn through the open panel, and at the morning filling the threshing floor. She was 62 years old. She had 31 years of records work, a restored barn, a grain archive in the early stages of becoming real, a brother who was talking about coming home, a financial situation that was no longer something she needed to think about the way she had spent her whole life thinking about it, and a great-grandfather who had trusted the future enough to seal his life's work behind a stone wall and leave it for whoever came. She thought about what Ruth had said. He believed in making things that lasted. She thought about what Franklin had written in the ledger. Whatever comes from these shares, I am leaving in the chamber for whoever finds them. If the barn stands long enough, they will. The barn had stood. She had come. And what came next? The archive, the work, the years she had not yet used, the things she had not yet built, was hers now to make last. She turned off her headlamp. The morning light from the threshing floor was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The Calloway Grain Archive opened its doors on the first Saturday of October, 1 year to the week after Nora had stood outside Harlan Royce's office and driven out to a barn that everyone agreed was worth nothing. Louise Hargrove organized a gathering of 40 or 50 people, farmers and their families, the Historical Society, the library, a delegation from Ohio State, including Dr. Marcus Webb, who stood in the threshing floor looking at the fanning mill with an expression of uncomplicated pleasure. Harold from the library arrived early and spent 20 minutes in the chamber alone before anyone else arrived. Nora found him standing with his hands folded, reading Franklin's penciled columns on the plaster wall. She left him to it. Nora had not prepared a speech. She stood near the chamber door when the crowd settled and spoke without notes. She said that her great-grandfather had built this barn in 1908 and run a grain brokerage out of it for 30 years and sealed his life's work behind a limestone wall in October of 1929 because he did not trust banks and did not trust the estate process and did not know what would happen next, but knew that honest work deserved to survive. She said that 95 years later she had stood in front of the wall with a tape measure and found a 6-foot discrepancy between the interior and the exterior and had looked for the door because she had spent 31 years as a records administrator and knew what an anomaly looked like. A few people laughed at that, gently. She said the ledgers were at Ohio State now, where researchers could use them. She said that what remained here, the barn, the chamber, the archive, was for Pickard County, for the farms whose records were still in boxes and attics and sheds and estate sales, for the history disappearing unless someone did the work of keeping it. She said that Franklin had been 62 when he wrote his last ledger entry, believing the best work of his life was finished. She said that she was 62, and that she was beginning to think he had been wrong about that. Dr. Webb shook her hand with both of his. Harold had to take his glasses off and clean them. Ruth hugged her briefly and firmly, the hug of a woman who does not give them freely and means them when she does. Stuart was there. He had driven from Denver with everything he needed in the back of his car and stood at the edge of the crowd during Nora's remarks, and afterward found her near the chamber door and stood beside her without saying anything for a while. "This is good," he said finally. "It's a start," she said. He found a small house 3 miles from the barn 2 weeks later and did not go back to Denver. He came out to the archive most days, reorganized the back storage room without being asked, built new shelving for the growing collection of donated farm records that had begun arriving as soon as news of the archive spread. Ledgers, photographs, receipts, letters, the accumulated record-keeping of families who had farmed this ground for generations and who had not known, until now, that there was somewhere to take it. Nora cataloged. She built the finding aids with the same system she had used in 31 years of hospital records work, adapted for this material, clear and cross-referenced, the kind of system a stranger could use without assistance. Franklin's careful copperplate was in that system somehow, the deep conviction that things worth doing were worth documenting. The hawk came back to the east field every morning. The creek ran. The barn stood in all weathers. The wavy glass in the east windows caught the morning light and bent it slightly, the way old glass does, throwing long patterns across the threshing floor that moved as the sun moved, the same light that had come through those windows for 100 years and more, falling on grain dust and machinery, and now on archive boxes and people doing the work of remembering. Nora kept the chamber exactly as it was. The chamber had maintained its own conditions for 95 years without assistance, and she decided to leave it alone. What was in it now was Franklin's letter, the founding document, the stock certificates, and the photograph. It was not storage. It was the origin point. People came to stand in it and read the penciled columns and understand that this archive had a root, that it grew from something specific, built on the work of a man who believed that honest work deserved to survive. She had asked a stone carver to cut a single line into the limestone lintel above the chamber's panel, in lettering that matched the period of the building. For words, Franklin's own, from the last entry in the 6th ledger. "The barn will stand." On a Tuesday morning in her second autumn at the barn, she was cataloging a donation that had come in the previous week, a collection of records from a family that had farmed a section of ground 6 miles east of the barn since 1891. The collection was in good condition. The oldest material, farm journals from the 1890s, was fragile, and she was working through it with cotton gloves and the same unhurrying attention Franklin had given to grain and the same attention she had given to hospital records for 3 decades, and the same attention that all careful work eventually requires, which is the belief that the thing in front of you is worth the time you're giving it. The October morning came through the east windows in 4 squares of light. The fanning mill turned very slightly in a draft from the open barn doors, as if moved by memory rather than air. The stone chamber stood open at the north wall, the lintel with its 4 words visible from where she sat. She turned the page of the farm journal carefully, the old paper soft under her gloves, and began to read. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.